From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Former President Donald Trump and the rest of the political world respond to the 37-count indictment unveiled Friday against the president by the Justice Department and Special Counsel Jack Smith for mishandling documents and obstructing justice. How strong is the indictment now that we've had a weekend to absorb its content? And what is the impact going to be on the 2024 election and the rest of American politics? Welcome. I'm Paul Gigot, editor of the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal, and here with two of my colleagues, Kim Strassel and Kyle Peterson. Hello, Kyle. Hello, Kim. So, Kim, we talked about this a little last week, but now that you've read this in detail, what do you think about the indictment and its strength?
Well, I think one of the failings of the indictment is that it completely fails to deal with this other law on the books, Presidential Records Act, which presumably does give Trump some very wide latitude in the handling of documents. And we don't exactly know the contours of where that law ends and the ones that the prosecutors here take precedence. That's something that the courts are going to have to figure out. But the fact that the prosecutors didn't even acknowledge it in the indictment and just suggested that this was another American citizen like any other rather than the former president of the United States does strike me as somewhat odd and weakens the indictment a little bit. When you go through the rest of what's in there, we've talked about this a little bit. Look, Donald Trump didn't do himself any favors by not handing over these documents. But I think that there's some stuff in here. The biggest strength that this has is obviously, I think, the pieces that suggest that Donald Trump directed his attorneys to try to get rid of some of these documents. If that is the case, also the conversation that was supposedly captured on audio in which he suggests that he didn't declassify these documents as president. He doesn't have the ability to do that now. Those are certainly things that could pose some real problems for his legal team. But I think that this is a more complex case than some have suggested in the press.
On the Presidential Records Act, fascinating to me the degree of disparate views on whether it applies or not. I had Mike Mukasey, the former Attorney General, on our TV show on the weekend. He told me privately he thought that the PRA just does not apply here because these are documents that are beyond the scope of anything in the PRA. David Rivkin, our friend and often legal source, says that's completely wrong. There's, in fact, a Supreme Court precedent that suggests that the president does have access, and that makes no distinction between classified and unclassified documents, that the president has enormous discretion here, and that the PRA implies a good faith negotiation over when a former president has access to those documents. Alan Dershowitz, in our pages today, the Harvard professor, says that he's struck by there was no mention of the PRA in the indictment. The president's lawyers, Kyle, are all over the airwaves saying, yeah, this gives the president the right to have those documents. And I assume they're going to use this in their defense. And I assume the Justice Department, since it didn't mention the PRA in the indictment, is going to say it doesn't apply. So there'll be a legal battle here.
No doubt that's going to be part of the president's defense. And to Kim's point, it can be hard to know beforehand sometimes how courts are going to decide to harmonize two statutes that were written at totally different times with different intentions. Different provisions.
And those statutes are the PRA, on the one hand, written in 1978 in the wake of the Nixon scandals, and the Espionage Act, under which Trump is now charged, which was written in 1917.
Correct. And so there may be appeals on how those statutes interact. You could imagine that going to the U.S. Supreme Court. But reading this as a non-lawyer, I tend to side with Mike Mukasey's view. So here is a provision of the Presidential Records Act. Upon the conclusion of a president's term of office, or if a president serves consecutive terms upon the conclusion of the last term, the archivist of the United States shall assume responsibility for the custody, control, and preservation of and access to the presidential records of that president. Then there's another provision that says presidential records of a former president shall be available to such former president. But I would make a few points about that. One is that you're right, there's no timeline for the negotiation of the handover. It's not as if the Presidential Records Act says that at 12:01, after the inauguration of the incoming president, all that stuff has to be boxed up and handed over. And so there's a negotiation there. But President Trump is not being charged with holding on to this stuff for weeks or months. The indictment doesn't charge him with the illegal retention of any of the stuff that he returned to the National Archives. He's charged with defying a subpoena and holding on to it for something like a year and a half. The language in the Presidential Records Act says that the National Archives controls the access to those records. So that suggests to me something like you'd imagine at an institutional library where all this stuff gets filed away and tracked. And so the president can say, I would like those 6 boxes to write my memoirs, and this is full of decision memos for a critical period in my time in office. And he checks that stuff out with the archives and then is expected to return it. But the biggest point to me is that I don't know that the Presidential Records Act has anything to say about handling or mishandling of these documents. If you have a security clearance that allows you to see an attack plan on another country generated by the Pentagon, I don't think the Presidential Records Act allows you to share that with a writer who's in your office writing a book. If you have a security clearance that allows you to have information that you're only supposed to view in a SCIF, a sensitive compartmented information facility is the acronym there, I don't think that allows you to keep that stuff in a banker's box in your bathroom by virtue of the Presidential Records Act.
Yeah, okay, fair enough. And I think this will be litigated. But then what you're talking about here, and let's not get into the obstruction point that Kim talked about, but just the retention of these documents. Joe Biden retained documents of a classified nature in his Corvette or near his Corvette in the garage and other places. This is not the kind of thing that you would say is proper for him to do. And that gets to the issue of the double standard of justice here. Now, I understand the Justice Department is trying to distinguish those cases by bringing up what they would describe as the willful resistance to turning over those documents. And I very much agree that that is the biggest vulnerability for Trump. And let's listen to former Attorney General Bill Barr talk about that.
It's a very detailed indictment, and it's very, very damning. And this idea of presenting Trump as a victim here, a victim of a witch hunt, is ridiculous. Yes, he's been a victim in the past. Yes, his adversaries have obsessively pursued him with phony claims. And I've been at his side defending against them when he is a victim. But this is much different. He's not a victim here. He was totally wrong that he had the right to have those documents. Those documents are among the most sensitive secrets that the country has. They have to be in the custody of the archivist. He had no right to maintain them and retain them.
Well, that'll be one of the arguments, Kim, whether he did in fact have some right to retain them, I think. But there's no question that, at least to my mind, reading the indictment, that some of the evidence that they have put in here, and it's so-called speaking indictment because it includes a lot more narrative than a lot of those indictments do. And the reason it does, I think, is because Jack Smith wanted to make as clear as possible to the country that there's a lot of evidence here. The point that Kyle made, the episode where Trump is discussing with a writer and a couple of staffers a document that seems to be related to a potential invasion of Iran, is pretty damning. I mean, it's bad for the president because it's out of his own mouth. This isn't a third-party witness or something. And he says, see, as president, I could have declassified it. And the staffer says, yeah, and laughter. Trump, now I can't, but this is still a secret. Staffer, yeah, now we have a problem. Trump, isn't that interesting? So this underscores your point, Kim, that he's often his own worst enemy.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of this is going to come down to intent, right? If you think about what Kyle was talking about when he read out from the Presidential Records Act, there is no set hard time frame in which you have to turn these over, okay? And you mentioned the examples of Joe Biden. I would also note that Mike Pence, they found certain documents in his possession that he shouldn't have had after the fact. I think this is the issue, is obviously the indictment is going to make the case that this was a willful defiance of a subpoena. I think what we need to be looking at is we haven't seen the argument from the defense side yet. And maybe their argument is going to be, okay, look, we did engage in sending documents back to the archivist. And in fact, that did happen. The Trump lawyers went through and sent things back over a period of time. They may then argue, look, what was left, we honestly didn't know it was there. It was missed. That was what ended up being found when the FBI sent its team down to look at Mar-a-Lago. So I'm not suggesting or taking a side in this. I'm just saying that what the indictment is suggesting is that this was a willful keeping of documents, trying to hide them and keep the archivist from getting them back. If the argument from the Trump side is, look, a lot of stuff was getting shuffled around and we missed these, then you're looking at a case where you say, how is that different than what happened in Biden's case or in Pence's case? And that's why some of those pieces in that indictment, as I mentioned in the beginning, and as you just reiterated, Paul, I think are most concerning, would be anything in the indictment that suggested that Trump knew that he had things he shouldn't have and that they were keeping them from their rightful place in the National Archives.
On that point, there's an episode in the indictment where a lawyer for Trump suggests that, Trump suggests, according to that lawyer's account, that, if there's something in there that's troublesome, we could pluck it out. And he makes a gesture of plucking a document out from the rest of the documents so that they wouldn't have to turn that over. That's the implication, at least, in the indictment. So not good, as the president might say, not good.